Good afternoon. It's after 3 p.m. already. The day's just a-wasting away. I'm just boiling the water for the last of my 2 water bottles on the stove there, on the old wood stove over that way. The rotten pipes and everything. Yeah. Anyway, that's it. Rocky's inside having a sleep in the window on his pillow. He loves that pillow. He just gets up on the window there and sleeps, and it's just a perfect spot for him, He can keep an eye on things, and he can snooze, and it works out pretty good. It's comfortable, and it's also a good vantage point to see what goes on outside. Anyway, I'm going to tell you a story. This is from when I was a little boy, way back in the early 1970s. And I'd have been about 3 years old when this happened. And anyway, I'll tell you this story. It's not a particularly nice story, but it is something that happened. And basically what had happened was, my mom and my dad, early in the morning, one morning, they got into a fight. And I don't know what the fight was about exactly, but I think it had something to do with money, because I remember my mom saying something about dough, about having some dough or needing some dough or whatever. And in those days, dough or bread was another term that was used for money. And it's the slang of the time or whatever. You never hear that anymore, but there was a lot of words that were used in a different context back then than they are now. And dough was a slang term for money. Anyway, I believe it was a fight over money. My dad, he tried to leave. He started heading for the door. My dad had bad temper, and he'd hit you. But he was trying to leave before that happened. I think he realized he was getting very close to hitting her, and he didn't want to, and so he needed to leave before he lost control and ended up hitting her. Well, she got between him and the door, positioned herself in front of the door, and then she started poking him in the chest with her fingers like this, backing him up and yelling in his face. Well, he reared back and he punched her in the head, knocked her back across the coffee table. Basically, she struck the back of her head or her neck or whatever against the edge of the coffee table, and she was out. So he picked her up and, he carried her into the bedroom and laid her down on their bed. And then he left. And now I was in there with my mother, and, I was 3 years old. I thought my mother was dead. I just learned about death. My mom could be kind of a harsh person. And how I had learned about death, it was just before that I had learned about death, actually. On CBC television, in those days we got like 3 channels of black and white television. That was it around here. And anyway, this was like 1971, And at noontime, there was a man used to come on right after the news. And at first they had a thing called Billboard, which was they talked about community events in the city of Ottawa because the signal was coming from Ottawa. And then after the Billboard thing was over, then there was a man would come in wearing a black suit, and he'd sit down at a desk in front of one of those old-fashioned type, chrome square-looking microphones. And he would very somberly say, "We respectfully direct your attention to the following announcements." And then he'd start reading the obituaries. He had papers there, and he'd read the obituaries. And he would say that a person was resting at such and such a chapel, or whatever, entered into rest on such and such a day or whatever, or was resting at such and such a chapel. Well, I asked my mom what he was talking about one day. Who are these people he's talking about? What does he mean when he says they're resting at such and such a place or whatever? And she says, well, those people are dead. And I said, dead? Well, what does that mean? What is dead? And she says, dead. They're dead. She said, when you die, then they put you in a box and they bury you in the ground, and the worms eat you up, and you just don't exist anymore. Well, of course, I started to cry at the thought of all these people. What are you crying for? She says, well, the idea of all these people, being buried in the ground and being eaten by worms. She said, well, they don't know anything. They're dead. And she said, you're going to die someday, too. You'll be dead, too, someday. Everybody is going to be dead someday. Well, of course, that made me cry even more, But that's how I learned about death. Anyway, I thought that my mom was dead. I didn't know she was unconscious. I thought she was dead. And so, we used to watch Gunsmoke. It was a Western show that was on. It went off the air a few years after that, but I think it was on the air until 1975 or something. Anyway, we used to watch that on Sunday nights. It was a show that went from the 1950s up into the early 70s. And I remember there was an episode of it. I remembered at the time there was an episode of it where they had found somebody in a bed in a room up above Miss Kitty's saloon. She had rooms upstairs, for rent. And they weren't able to wake him up. And they didn't know if he was passed out drunk or if he had died. And so the doctor came. They had the doctor come up into the room. And the doctor took a little hand mirror out of his bag. And he put it under the guy's nose. And he said, if the mirror fogs up, that means he's breathing, so he's alive. If it don't fog up, then that means he ain't breathing, and so he's dead. So, of course, being 3 years old, I thought, well, the doctor from Gunsmoke must know what he's talking about. He's a doctor, after all. So, I was 3 years old, I found me a little hand mirror. I climbed up on the bed, and I put it under my mother's nose, and it didn't fog up. Well, now I was sure that my mother was dead. She must be. She's not breathing. The doctor on Gunsmoke said if the mirror don't fog up, that means she ain't breathing, means she's dead. So now I'm thinking, well, here I am 3 years old, and I'm all alone here, and I got my mother's in the bed dead, and what am I going to do? And I was pretty scared anyway. And I sat on the floor in the corner of the room, frightened, and I didn't know what to do. At one point, I thought about going over to our neighbors, Harry and Mattie Matheson, who were our neighbors, and they were always really good to me. I was friends with their granddaughter. I talk about them a little bit in other videos, and about the granddaughter, and about a situation that was happening in her life, too. But at the time, with her mother, who she believed had been killed in a car accident. She believed both her parents had been killed in a car accident, but they hadn't been. That was just a story that was told. And I do talk about that in another video anyway. Her mother actually was very much alive. But anyway, there was some scandal around the way that my friend was, because it was out of wedlock, and she was conceived out of wedlock and stuff. Anyway, I thought about going over to their place and asking for help. But even at 3 years old, I knew how society worked. And that was called airing your dirty laundry. If I went over there and told them that my father had hit my mother and now she was dead, that would be airing our dirty laundry, talking about our family's problems, to outsiders, and you didn't do that. And even at 3 years old, I understood that that was something you never do. And so And in that society back then, you didn't. That was just unheard of, that you would ever talk to anybody about private matters of that nature, you know. And so I sat there in the corner of the room, and I sat there until, it was after dark. It was after dark, I know that. It was well after dark. And so it was quite a few hours, because this had happened early in the morning. And my mom didn't move the whole time, and I hardly moved from that spot that whole time. I just sat in the corner staring at my mother for the most part. I hardly moved, you know. Anyway, it ended up well after dark she came to. She had no idea. She was all woozy and had no idea. She was talking like she didn't know what had happened. She wasn't too sure where she was or anything. But I remember that anyway. She came to. Well, after that, she started to take migraine headaches. And this got to be a regular thing for many years. Then in the 1980s, she started going to a chiropractor. And the chiropractor x-rayed her neck and her head and her spine and everything, you know. The chiropractor said to her, "Have you ever been in a serious car accident, like where you were thrown head first through a windshield or anything?" She said, "No, that never had that happen." And he said, "Well, the only place I've ever seen this type of an injury would be in somebody who had experienced trauma like that." He said, "Your neck bones, your spinal column going through your neck is in the shape of a Z." He said. Anyway, he did adjustments on her, and he was able to pretty much alleviate the migraine headaches. She had to go back repeatedly and have these adjustments done. But over time, over time the adjustments alleviated the headaches anyway, these migraine headaches she'd been taking. But the migraine started right after that, so that was probably the cause of them. Here's my fire. My water wants to boil. It does. It's getting close. I can hear it a bit. Anyway, that was the story. That's what happened anyway there, you know. And yeah, I remember that when I was only 3 years old in 1971. That's what happened. My dad did come home. Eventually he did come home, but yeah, that's just one story anyway from my childhood that I remember pretty vividly. I actually have memories going back even to when I was a little baby. As strange as that sounds, I do. A lot of people don't believe me when I tell them that. A lot of people tell me they can't remember anything prior to when they were like 8 years old. And so they don't think it's normal to remember things going that far back. I can't explain it. I guess everybody's different. In my case, I do remember that, and I remember a lot of other things from that era too. Anyway, that's it for now. That's the story. Yeah, we'll talk to you later.